Hi, welcome to the 14-day weather forecast. Things have been quite changeable recently. In fact, Storm Otto brought damaging gusts of wind to the northern half of the UK, but in the south, amounts of rain have remained small. So, how are things shaping up as we leave the meteorological winter and head into the spring? I'm going to begin by taking a look at the stratosphere. The important thing to remember here is that a sudden stratospheric warming, an SSW, increases the chance of cold weather in the UK a few weeks after it occurs. It does not guarantee it. We have in fact had a major SSW during the last week or so, and according to this data from the GEFS model, another one is on the way, because what it shows is forecast zonal wind speeds at 60 degrees north, high up in the stratosphere. When they go negative, that is indicative of a major sudden stratospheric warming. Instead of flowing from west to east, the zonal winds are going from east to west, and it's what all the runs are showing from around the 27th of February. Another point to note here is that through the rest of the plot, well into March, the 9th of March where it finishes, zonal winds from all of the runs remaining in that easterly phase. It could well be the final warming of the winter stroke spring. That means that the stratospheric polar vortex may not recover until the autumn. So, is an SSW imminent? Yes, it is. We've already had one, and the second is approaching in the coming days. Will it have an impact on our weather? Quite possibly, but the most acute impacts could well be felt after the 2-week forecast period, which I'm going to be discussing here. Anyway, back to the first week and the view across Europe and the North Atlantic. The animation runs from 18 GMT, Tuesday the 21st of February. As I've already suggested, it's quite a changeable theme at the outset. There's a band of rain here which is moving southeastwards and fragmenting as it does so, but then somewhat colder air moves down from the north into Thursday, Friday, and further outbreaks of rain push across the northern part of the UK, and they will be tending to move southwards but weakening as they do so. Not a great deal of rain in the south. Through the weekend, the high pressure becomes dominant once again. It really sits there and doesn't go anywhere fast as we head into the first part of next week. By Wednesday, the 1st of March, though, when this animation finishes, there are some indications of it building a little bit further to the northwest, more of a northeasterly flow pushing down across the southern half of the UK, and cloudy conditions perhaps bringing a little bit of showery rain. It's a mostly settled scenario, though. Very, very little rain I would expect if it's correct. Looking at the air temperature sequence associated with that GFS computer model run, the greens over the UK to begin with, suggesting fairly close to average temperatures at about 1,500 metres above sea level. The blue shading is the colder air, and that moves southwards across the UK at times through the first week. And by the end of the period, the high pressure sitting here means that green shadings covering central and northern areas, and the easterly flow to its south is bringing colder air across continental Europe, and it's possibly just flirting with the far south of Britain. But this isn't a very cold air mass. It's not like the beast from the east, which we saw in February, March 2018. Nothing like it. What does all that mean then in terms of the temperatures down at the ground level through the first week? Here are forecast maximums for Wednesday the 22nd. 7s, 8s or 9s in much of England and Wales, a little bit colder air in Scotland and Northern Ireland. Going forwards to Friday, very little change. There will be some chilly nights though, patchy frost throughout the first week I would expect. It's going to depend on cloud cover and wind strength, for example, on that GFS model run, but with some indications towards the end of the first week of isobars becoming more closely packed together in the south as that east or northeasterly flow developed, and that would reduce the chance of frost if it's correct. But forecast minimums here for Saturday morning, close to or just a little bit below freezing quite widely. Monday the 27th, the maximums once more, very, very little change, perhaps 10 Celsius there in the London area at the top end of the scale, a few degrees lower as you go northwards into Scotland and Northern Ireland. But not a great deal of variation through week 1, and that's really reinforced by this plot from the UK Met Office Mogreps G ensemble. It's showing temperatures for London. They rise a bit during the days, they dip through the nights, and the pattern really continues throughout the week. Minimums maybe around 3 or 4 Celsius, but this is for London, so in more rural areas, the lower values will lead to a greater risk of frost than in the city centre. And just looking at the comparable chart for Manchester, just to see the situation further north, not a great deal of difference. Some of the overnight lows there a little bit down on the London values, but a very, very similar pattern indeed. Rainfall. Well, with high pressure around, there's going to be a lot of dry weather through the first week. The charts here, though, are showing forecast accumulations in millimetres for days 0 to 5, ECM on the left, GFS on the right. It's really only northern and western Scotland where amounts are significant, although ECM does show somewhat higher values in southern and central parts of Britain than the GFS chart does. Moving forwards to the 0 to 10 day period, not much has changed. The wettest conditions very much focused on western and northern Scotland. Rain totals in southern and central Britain have hardly shifted at all, suggesting that days 5 to 10 will be mostly dry in those areas. So, how do the deterministic models compare with each other towards the end of the first week? Here's the GFS, 28th of February. High pressure centred here, just building a little bit further north with that cold air moving across continental Europe and, just as I suggested, flirting with southern and maybe central parts of Britain. The Canadian model at the same time, the high pressure a tad further south and some relatively warm or even quite warm air sitting underneath it. The cold stuff much further east and moving southwards there, but well to the east of the United Kingdom. The German icon model, high pressure here, similar I think to the GFS, the cold air perhaps a little bit closer to the UK than the Canadian. The European ECM, also high pressure dominated, but the cold air here staying well to our southeast. The orange shading there just to the northeast, showing where the very mild upper level air is. And finally, the UK Met Office global model, high pressure firmly in charge, the cold upper level air staying well clear of the United Kingdom. It's important though to emphasise that even though the air aloft on a number of those charts is mild or even warm, it doesn't necessarily mean that conditions down at the surface would be very mild. The nights are still quite long, the temperatures can drop away quickly, so the risk of frost would probably continue. But daytime values, I would expect on a number of these, not really that far from the average. In fact, in the afternoon sunshine, if there was any, it could feel quite pleasant. Reasonable agreement though, in fact very good agreement in terms of the big picture, which is for high pressure to be dominant. Reasonable agreement in terms of the details in where it will be positioned. Just for GFS, I think taking it a little bit further northwest at this point, leading to a greater chance of colder air pushing into southern Britain. A settled scenario though, according to all of these deterministic models. So, with that said, how are things looking as we go into and through week 2? It's all about trends and probabilities, of course, at this range, not the details. Starting with the 16-day GEFS plot for London. Air mass temperatures are close to the norm at the start of the period, and they rise, at least the ensemble mean does. The thick purple line, it's climbing several degrees above the thick black line, which is the 30-year norm. The point, though, to take away from this is that there is a big spread developing, a huge spread towards the end of the second week. Some runs dipping down to -15 Celsius, while others are going up to +10 Celsius. It's important, as I say, to remember that these are values at 1,500 metres above sea level. but it's the spread which indicates uncertainty, and that's largely due, I should imagine, to where the pressure blocks have been positioned. Does high pressure build further north, northwest, or over Scandinavia? In that case, much colder air would be making its way down across the UK, and that's what a number of these runs are showing. But there's also the possibility that high pressure would be centred just maybe to the east of the UK or to the southeast, and that would allow a milder south or southwesterly flow to move across us, and that's what some of these runs could well be pointing to. Because, looking at the bottom half of the chart, there are very few spikes there. Not much sign of rain. Each spike shows rain being forecast by one of the runs in the ensemble, and certainly through the first 5 or 6 days, they are notable by their absence. Just a gentle indication that at the very end, things could be starting to turn more changeable as a few small spikes show up. The snow row across the bottom, values not really climbing above 5, 6 or 7. The maximum it can be is 33, so a low chance of snow falling in southern Britain through the second week. But the emphasis really there on dry conditions, uncertainty about the upper air temperature profile and how it's going to develop. But most of the runs a little bit above the average early on, but then an increasing number of them dip down later, as can be seen on the data table here. The purples indicate the colder runs at 1,500 metres above sea level, and in brackets, the percentage of runs dipping down to or below -10 Celsius is shown. And really at this time of year, as we head towards the end of February and into the first third of March, values at the 850 HPA level for deep cold in the UK really need to be dipping down below -10, because the sun is increasingly strong through the days. There's more warming down at the surface. We've got a maximum here of 16% of runs going for -10 Celsius or lower. That's on Monday, the 6th of March. So although there's a lot of purple showing up and quite a lot of blue, very little yellow and green on this particular data table, it looks quite cold, but because of the time of the year, the lengthening days, I don't think it's necessarily a particularly cold outlook. And that's reflected by the 2-metre temperature data table. The light greens remain dominant. They decrease a little bit through the second week, but there's also some yellow. Those are runs going for 11 to 15 Celsius maximums at the surface. There's even a little bit of orange there, one run going for 16 to 20 Celsius. It's the dark greens, though, which are indicating cold daytime temperatures, and they are in a minority. They are the ones which go for maximums of between 1 and 5 Celsius, although by the very end, the number is up to 39%, and there's even a little bit of blue there. One of the runs which is going for maximums of 0 Celsius or lower. That's a big outlier, of course. It's the only run going for anything that cold in the south. So all in all, not particularly cold down at the ground level, despite that cold-ish upper air temperature profile which has been forecast. Manchester, very, very similar, so I'll not talk about it a great deal because the changes, the differences between this one and London, not really significant, though perhaps a greater risk of rain than there was on the London plot towards the end of the week. 2-metre temperature data table for Manchester, mostly light green. The amount of dark green, though, increases through week 2, reaching a maximum of 42%. So that cooling trend as more colder runs come into the mix, but all in all, not particularly cold by any means, if that data is correct. Up to Glasgow, the air temperature profile, very similar. A lot of the runs above the average early on. In fact, the deviation here is bigger than in the south. And if you remember on some of those deterministic charts, which I showed for the end of week 1, the yellows and oranges were really over the northern half UK, closer to the centre of high pressure. But later on, there is a downwards trend, but once more, there's a huge spread of possible outcomes there. Low confidence. In terms of rain and snow, not many spikes at all, even in this part of the UK for the first few days. But towards the end, the risk of rain increases, a number of spikes there starts to climb. The snow row reaches a maximum of 13 at the very end, so chance of snow increasing towards the end of the second week and maybe a little bit beyond it, but it's low to moderate for much of the period. And of course, the snow row just points towards the possibility of a few flakes of snow falling. It makes no forecasts about accumulation, so it could just be a couple of flakes of snow in a shower. The 2 metre temperature data table for Glasgow, light greens making up the bulk of the columns early on, dark greens there increasing towards the end, so a similar trend to Manchester and London, but certainly through the early part of the period it doesn't look particularly cold through the days, but it's really important to emphasise with high pressure being in the ascendancy, the nights are likely to be remaining quite cold and the risk of frost ongoing across southern, central and northern areas. It will depend on things like cloud cover and wind strength, as I hinted. The 10-day GEFS, mean surface level pressure plot, so it's averaging out all of the runs in the ensemble for Friday the 3rd of March, suggests that high pressure will be building northwestwards, maybe ridging up towards Greenland. Very cold air to our northeast, making its way southwards. There are indications from this that a cold pattern is setting up, and that ties in with that increasing number of runs which bring in -10 Celsius or lower air at the 850 HPA level. But it's very tenuous, of course, at this stage, and because it's so late in the season, everything just needs to fall into place perfectly for cold or very cold weather to become established in the UK. The ECM plot at the same time is a little bit different. The high pressure perhaps not showing the same tendency to ridge up towards Iceland and Greenland as the GEFS. The cold air a long way to our northeast, but settled is the key message from both of those two charts. The data table is showing mean surface level pressure, so these are going forwards rather than being a static snapshot like the last two were. The one on the left is for London, the one on the right for York. Interesting because the York plot has more orange in its columns, certainly through the first few days, and what that indicates is that high pressure is likely to be centred further north across the northern part of the UK rather than to our south, which has been the case for much of the time recently, and that's why we could possibly see somewhat colder air moving across southern Britain at times towards the end of week 1 and through week 2. But as I suggested, the key point to take on board is that it looks as though high pressure will be keeping the weather quiet, mostly settled, days rather chilly perhaps at times, but all in all not far from the average, but the risk of night frosts remaining quite widespread. So to summarise the 2 weeks, week 1, rain clears eastwards and temperatures dip. Another band of rain then moves down from the north, but it fragments and fades away. So a good deal of dry weather, although for a time wintry showers affect the north and there could be a few in the east as well. The risk of frost and fog continues. Temperatures during the days a little bit on the low side, but in the afternoon sunshine, or at least where sunny spells develop, it should not feel too bad at all. Week 2, high pressure remains dominant, so it's a mostly dry scenario, although it could build a little bit further north. If that happens, showers may push into southern counties. Frost and fog continue. Daytime temperatures probably not far from the average. There is a sign, a weak sign really, of it turning more changeable later with an increasing risk of rain, something to keep an eye on. But also approximately 20% of the computer model runs in the ensemble are going for much colder conditions towards the very end of the second week and beyond. Perhaps indicative of developments in the stratosphere, which I discussed at the start of the video. So, there we have it. The meteorological winter would appear to be ending on a quiet note with high pressure really being dominant. There are some tentative indications of wintry conditions returning as we go into the meteorological spring, as the impacts of that sudden stratospheric warming begin to be felt. But it's very, very tentative at the moment, and there isn't anything to suggest a repeat of the beast from the east spell of weather which we had in March 2018. But never rule it out. It's a possibility, albeit a low one. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, then please remember to hit the like and subscribe buttons below. Thanks very much for watching now. Bye.